First of all is this notion of immediate goal-based habits versus identity-based habits. Immediate goal-based habits are going to be habits that are designed to bring you a specific outcome as you do them. So each and every time you do them. So for instance, it might be that you want to develop a habit of getting, 60 minutes of zone 2 cardio each day, or perhaps, 3-4 times a week as we head into the new year. I've talked before on the podcast about the fact that the scientific literature and the health literature really points to the incredibly positive effects of getting 150 minutes to 180 minutes per week minimum of what's called zone 2 cardio. Zone 2 cardio is basically any cardiovascular exercise that gets you moving and your heart pumping and breathing, but not so hard that you can't hold a conversation. It kind of puts you at the threshold of being just able to have a conversation that's a little bit strained. But if you were to exercise a little bit harder, run a little bit faster, et cetera, you wouldn't be able to talk while you did it. There's a lot of literature that points to that as a healthy practice. So maybe you're somebody that wants to get more of zone 2 cardio, for instance. That would be an immediate goal-based habit. If your goal is to get that cardio maybe 4 times a week, every time you do it, you could check off a little box and you'd say, okay, I did it. You met the goal. That is different than so-called identity-based habits, where there's a larger overarching theme to the habit, where you're trying to become, quote unquote, a fit person, or you're somebody who wants to be an athlete or something of that sort. It's where you start to attach some sort of larger picture about yourself or what it means for you to do that habit, where there's both the immediate goal, right? Complete the exercise, complete the session or whatever it is, check off that box, but that you're linking it to some sort of larger goal. Now, why am I making this distinction? I mean, first of all, I'm not the one to first make this distinction. Others have made the distinction between identity versus immediate goal-based habit formation. But the reason I'm making the distinction is that pretty soon in our discussion today, we are going to talk about dopamine, a molecule that's associated with motivation and reward that we make in our brain, and how different schedules of dopamine release predict whether or not we will stick to a habit or not. And in particular, whether or not we will be able to form that habit quickly or not. Now, this is absolutely critical to understand for the following reason. Another thing that you'll hear out there in the literature is that it takes 21 days to form a habit. Some people say 18, some people say 21, some people say 30 days, some people say 60 days. So which one is it? Does it depend on the habit that one is trying to form, or does it depend on the person that's trying to form the habit? Well, it turns out that there's excellent peer-reviewed data on this. There's a study published in 2010, first author Lally, L-A-L-L-Y. This study found that for the same habit to be formed, it can take anywhere from 18 days to as many as 254 days for different individuals to form that habit. The reason I bring this up is that I always get asked, is it true that it takes 21 days to form a habit? Is it true that your nervous system changes in 6 days when you're doing something repeatedly? And the answer is, as I mentioned before, it's highly variable. What I didn't tell you actually was what specific habit they were looking at in that Lally study. And it's interesting that the specific behavior was a health-related behavior. It's pretty relevant to our discussion here on the podcast, which was taking walks after dinner. There's actually a really nice literature showing that walks after a meal can speed glucose clearance from the bloodstream, can be beneficial for not just weight loss, but cardiovascular health, et cetera. So a walk after dinner seems pretty straightforward, right? Well, in order to form that habit, it took some people 18 days and other people 254 days. How did they know when they formed the habit? Well, they were doing it about 85% of the time. And they also reported not having to spend that much mental effort in order to get into the mode of taking a walk after dinner. So for those of you listening, some of you might be thinking, I can't believe that it would take some people 254 days to get into that habit. But as I said, people are highly variable. And if you can't form one habit easily, it doesn't mean that you can't form other habits easily. The mystery of why certain people can form certain habits more easily than others probably has something to do with how well people manage what's called limbic friction. Now, limbic friction is not a term that you're going to find in the formal neurobiological literature or even psychological literature. It's frankly a term that I coined to encompass a number of different pieces of the psychology and neuroscience literature. Limbic friction is a shorthand way that I use to describe the strain that's required in order to overcome one of two states within your body. One state is one of anxiousness, where you're really anxious and therefore you can't calm down, you can't relax, and therefore you can't engage in some particular activity or thought pattern that you would like. The other state is one in which you're feeling too tired or lazy or not motivated. Both of those states, feeling too alert and too calm, if you will, relate to the function of the so-called autonomic nervous system, a set of neurons and hormones and chemicals in your brain and body that act as sort of a seesaw. You're either alert or calm. You're either asleep or stressed. Those two states are not compatible with one another. You've probably heard of wired and tired, but that's really once you've been very stressed for a long time to the point where you're exhausted. What does the autonomic nervous system have to do with any of this? Well, limbic friction is a phrase that can be used to describe how much effort, how much activation energy you need in order to engage in a particular behavior. So using this Lally study as an example, some people would eat dinner and then say, oh, that's right, I'm trying to develop the habit of taking a walk after dinner, so let's get up and go. Other people will feel like, I just don't want to do it today. They're going to feel too much limbic friction, and that limbic friction could arrive, again, from one of two sources. It could be because they are too tired to do it, or it could be because they're too anxious and distracted in order to do it. So this is a key distinction. A lot of habit formation has to do with being in the right state of mind and being able to control your state of body and mind. So as we march forward, what you're going to find is that this phrase or this term, limbic friction, is going to be a useful metric or way for you to touch in with yourself and address whether or not you are likely to be able to form a certain habit easily or whether or not it's going to be very challenging. And I'm going to teach you a way to measure your degree of limbic friction. That is, how much activation energy it will take in order for you to execute a new habit. And I'm going to teach you how to measure your limbic friction and activation energy for how likely it is that you're going to be able to break a habit that you don't want to have. The other key concept for us to address that's really mainly found in the books and articles out there about habits is this notion of what I call linchpin habits. Linchpin habits are certain habits that make a lot of other habits easier to execute. Now, the sorts of linchpin habits that I'm referring to are always going to be things that you enjoy doing. I'll just give you an example from my life. I happen to like exercise, not all forms of exercise, but I happen to like resistance training and I happen to like running. So I'm personally in the habit of getting cardiovascular exercise 3 or 4 times per week, maybe 30 to 60 minutes per session. And I'm in the habit of doing resistance training 3 or 4 times per week, typically also for about 45 to 60 minutes per session. Now, I enjoy those, and for reasons that I'll get into a little bit later, I place those activities typically early in the day because of the neurochemistry and the various types of hormones, et cetera, that are associated with performing those activities. But I really place those activities under the umbrella of what I call linchpin habits. Why? Because those particular habits are easy to execute because I enjoy them, but they also make a lot of other habits easier to execute. Things like being alert for work, things like making sure that I get good sleep the night before, things like hydration, things like making sure that I eat the foods that are better for me than maybe some of the other foods that I would more reflexively reach to if I weren't doing that training. So certain habits act as linchpins, meaning that they shift a lot of other things. They can control and bias the likelihood that, in this case, you or me, will perform other habits that are harder to access, that we have less of an affinity for. So again, there's 3 concepts that we need to include here. We've got identity-based versus goal-based habits. We've got the concept that different habits take different periods of time to adopt depending on the person and the habit, and that there are these what I call linchpin habits, certain habits that make other habits easier to execute. And those linchpin habits always are things that we enjoy doing. With each repetition of a habit, small changes occur in the cognitive and neural mechanisms associated with procedural memory. So I just want to talk for a second about what procedural memory is. In the neuroscience of memory, we distinguish between what's called episodic memory and procedural memory. Episodic memory is a recall of a particular set of events that happened, whereas procedural memory is holding in mind the specific sequence of things that need to happen in order for a particular outcome to occur. So think of it like a recipe or a protocol, or if for sake of exercise, it's like sets and reps, or a particular course that you're going to run or cycle, or the number of laps you're going to swim and how you're going to perform it. it's very clear that for anyone trying to adopt new habits, getting into the mindset of procedural memory is very useful for overcoming that barrier that we call limbic friction. How do you do that? Well, a simple visualization exercise, or it doesn't even have to be done eyes closed. Oftentimes we hear visualization exercise. You think about sitting in the lotus position, eyes closed, and trying really hard to visualize something. It doesn't need to be anything like that. It can simply be, if you are deciding to adopt a new habit, to just think about the very specific sequence of steps that's required to execute that habit. And I'll use a trivial example, but this could be applied to anything. Let's say I want to get into the habit of making myself or someone else in my household a cup of espresso every morning. I would actually think through each of those steps, walk into the kitchen, turn on the espresso machine, draw the espresso, walking through each of those steps from start to finish. And it turns out just that simple mental exercise done once can shift people toward a much higher likelihood of performing that habit regularly, not just the first time, but as they continue out into the days and weeks that follow. So that's remarkable to me. And the literature is really robust. Just one mental exercise of thinking through what are the sequence of steps required in order to perform this habit from start to finish can shift the likelihood of being able to perform that habit from unlikely or to moderately likely to very likely over time. And that's because it pulls from this process that involves our hippocampus and our neocortex and other areas of our brain and nervous system that engage in procedural memory. It shifts the brain towards a mindset, if you will. It's more of a neural circuit set, it would be more accurate, but a mindset / neural circuit set of doing things in a particular sequence, which allows that limbic friction to come down and increases the likelihood that we're going to perform that thing. Simple tool, but very powerful tool according to the psychology literature. And if you are somebody who used to perform a habit and you don't understand why you dropped it and you're frustrated with yourself and you're trying to figure out how you can get back into that habit, well, by all means, lean right back into that habit. But if you're having trouble doing that, also just use the procedural memory exercise in order to shift your nervous system toward a higher likelihood that you will return to that habit. Just the same way I described for trying to initiate a new habit. So now I'd like to discuss a second and what I think is perhaps the most powerful tool for being able to acquire and stick to new habits. This tool is rooted in what we call neural circuits, and I do think it is important to understand a little bit about how those neural circuits work. For those of you that are saying, just tell me what to do, I have to say, as I always say, understanding a little bit or a lot of underlying mechanism will help solidify these concepts for you and will help ensure that the tools that I offer are going to make sense and that they're going to make sense in different contexts and for different types of habits that you're trying to learn. So rather than just tell you what to do, I'm going to tell you how this particular tool works. And then in doing that, you should be able to apply it to any habit under any conditions. The tool that I'm referring to is something called task bracketing. And the neural circuits associated with task bracketing are basically the neural circuits that are going to allow you to learn any new type of habit or break any habit that you'd like to break. We have in our brain a set of neural circuits that fall under the umbrella term of the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia are involved in action execution, meaning doing certain things, and action suppression, not doing certain things. In the experimental realm, these are referred to as go, meaning do, or no go, don't do certain things. And some of us fall more into the category of we find it very easy to do certain things, but harder to not do other things. Some people have a lot of no-go type circuits that are very robust, and they have a lot of behavioral constraint, but they have a harder time getting into action. And some people have a perfect balance of both, but I've never met one of those people. So again, drawing from, more or less paraphrasing from this beautiful review that I described earlier in Annual Review of Psychology, by Wood and Runger, task bracketing involves a particular set of neural circuits within the basal ganglia. So I'm going to describe this here, again, paraphrasing, a sensory motor loop. Sensory means just input coming in about sight, sounds, tastes, etc. And then the motor systems, the systems of the brain and body that generate action, taking that information and generating action. So it turns out that there's an area of our basal ganglia called the dorsolateral striatum. We can use the acronym DLS. Again, dorsolateral striatum. Dorso means up, lateral means to the side, so dorsolateral, and striatum is a subdivision of the basal ganglia. And it's very important for the establishment of behaviors that are associated with a habit, but not necessarily the habit itself. And beautiful studies in both animals and humans that record the electrical activity in the dorsolateral striatum find that the dorsolateral striatum is associated, meaning it becomes active at the beginning of a particular habit and at the very end and after a particular habit. Hence the phrase task bracketing. It brackets the habit. Now, other sets of neurons are going to be active during the actual execution of the habit. But what the literature on the dorsolateral striatum tells us is that we have particular circuits in our brain that are devoted to framing the events that happen just before and as we initiate a habit, and just after and as we terminate a habit. In other words, it acts as a sort of marker for the habit execution, but not the execution of the habit per se. Now, this is very important because task bracketing is what underlies whether or not a habit will be context dependent or not, whether or not it will be strong and likely to occur even if we didn't get a good night's sleep the night before, even if we're feeling distracted, even if we are not feeling like doing something emotionally, or if we are, completely overwhelmed by other events. If the neural circuits for task bracketing are deeply embedded in us, meaning they are very robust around a particular habit, well, then it's likely that we're going to go out for that zone 2 cardio no matter what, that we're going to brush our teeth no matter what. In fact, brushing our teeth is a pretty good example because for most people, even if you got a terrible night's sleep, even if everything in your life is going wrong, chances are, unless you're very depressed, if you're going to leave to work, or even if you're not, that you're going to still carry out the behavior of brushing your teeth in the morning. I would hope so, actually. But you are probably less likely to perform particular habits that are not what you deem as necessary. But if you think about it, brushing your teeth, exercise, eating particular foods, maybe engaging socially in particular ways, you are the one that places any kind of value assessment on which ones are essential and which ones are negotiable. So task bracketing sets a neural imprint, a kind of a fingerprint in your brain of this thing has to happen at this particular time of day, so much so that it's reflexive.